Most people think of World War II food shortages as a temporary hardship, bad meals endured until supply lines recovered and normal life resumed. What's less discussed is that many wartime substitutions were not inferior stopgaps at all. In some cases, they were more efficient, more stable, and more nutritionally sound than the ingredients they replaced. They emerged not from culinary creativity, but from logistical necessity, industrial limits, and the unforgiving mathematics of feeding millions under blockade. These food swaps quietly reshaped how armies planned rations, how civilians survived scarcity, and how modern food science evolved after the war. Before we go further, if you value serious, detail-driven history like this, history that looks at survival, systems, and consequences rather than just headlines, subscribe to the Survival Record. This channel exists for people who want to understand how humans actually endured extreme conditions and what those lessons still mean today. The war forced nations to rethink food not as comfort but as fuel and strategy. By 1939, most industrialized nations already depended on fragile global supply chains. War shattered those systems almost immediately. Blockades cut off imports, shipping losses mounted, and agricultural labor collapsed as men were conscripted. Food was no longer a matter of preference or tradition. It became, well, an equation of calories, shelf life, transport weight, and, honestly, morale. Substitutions were introduced, not because they tasted good, but because they worked, sometimes, even better than what they replaced. Fresh eggs are fragile, perishable, and, pretty bulky. Powdered eggs, developed earlier but refined during the war, solved all three problems. So, dehydration reduced weight, eliminated spoilage risk, and allowed for long-term storage without any need for refrigeration. For military kitchens, powdered eggs ensured a consistent protein intake across, all theatres of war. After the war, studies showed that nutritional loss was actually pretty minimal compared to the huge logistical gains. Modern emergency food systems still rely on powdered eggs for exactly the same reasons, even though fresh eggs are, widely available these days. Margarine quietly replaced butter as a strategic fat source. Butter, on the other hand, requires refrigeration, dairy herds, and constant supply chains. Margarine, produced from vegetable oils, could be manufactured at scale, stored longer, and transported more efficiently. Wartime shortages forced populations to adopt it fully, not as a novelty, but as a necessity. Nutritionally, margarine provided comparable calories and essential fats, and in many climates it proved more stable than butter. This substitution permanently altered civilian diets in Europe and North America long after rationing ended. Whole grain bread replaced white bread for reasons beyond scarcity. White bread wasn't just harder to produce during wartime, it was less efficient. Milling wheat into white flour actually removed the bran and germ, which meant wasting a lot of calories and, important nutrients. So governments really pushed whole grain bread not just to conserve grain, but also to improve public health. Studies conducted during the war showed that reduced deficiency illnesses were seen in populations consuming higher extraction flour. This wasn't just ideology, it was applied nutrition under pressure, and honestly, it directly influenced post-war dietary guidelines. Dried legumes surprisingly became a protein source that meat just couldn't rival. Meat production simply collapsed under wartime strain. Feed shortages, transport limits, and refrigeration failures made large-scale meat distribution unreliable. Dried beans, lentils and peas required none of that infrastructure. They stored indefinitely, traveled easily, and provided high protein and fiber. In both military rations and civilian diets, legumes filled nutritional gaps more reliably than fresh meat ever could under siege conditions. Modern survival planning still leans heavily on this wartime lesson. Powdered milk solved a problem refrigeration never could. Fresh milk spoils quickly and requires cold storage. Powdered milk, processed through evaporation and drying, became a cornerstone of wartime nutrition, especially for children. It retained calcium and protein while eliminating dependence on daily delivery. In bombed cities and rural evacuation zones, powdered milk ensured continuity of nutrition when dairy supply chains failed entirely. Today's humanitarian food aid systems trace directly back to these wartime innovations. Saccharin and beet sugar proved that, well, sweetness was optional, not essential. Cane sugar imports vanished under blockade. In response, European nations expanded beet sugar production and permitted widespread use of saccharin. While neither fully replicated sugar's culinary role, both maintained morale and caloric intake at minimal resource cost. Saccharin's extreme sweetness-to-weight ratio made it ideal for transport and storage, a factor still relevant in modern ration design. The war demonstrated that psychological comfort could be preserved without luxury ingredients. Root vegetables replaced imported staples with brutal efficiency. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, and parsnips thrived in poor soil and cold climates. They required very little processing and, stored well underground. Governments promoted them pretty aggressively because they produced more calories per acre than grain did under wartime conditions. While these vegetables are often associated with deprivation, they actually prevented mass starvation in several countries. Their resilience under stress honestly made them foundational to survival agriculture doctrine after the war. Fish protein filled gaps that, land-based systems just could not. Naval blockades strangled meat imports, but coastal and inland fishing actually remained viable in many regions. Fish provided essential protein and fats without relying on feed crops or extensive infrastructure. Dried, smoked, and salted fish became, critical substitutes for fresh meat. Wartime reliance on fish really reshaped post-war food policy in several countries, reinforcing the value of diversified protein sources. Coffee substitutes revealed how habits adapt under pressure. Coffee shortages led to substitutes made from roasted chicory, barley, and even acorns. While nutritionally insignificant, these replacements preserved ritual and routine. That mattered more than taste. Wartime planners recognized that maintaining daily habits supported morale and psychological resilience. Modern survival psychology acknowledges the same principle. Continuity of routine sustains mental endurance during prolonged stress. Synthetic vitamin fortification quietly prevented a nutritional collapse. As diets narrowed, deficiencies loomed. So, governments responded with fortified foods, adding synthetic vitamins to flour, margarine, and milk substitutes. These interventions were subtle, but honestly pretty transformative. Diseases like rickets and pellagra, they really declined in populations under rationing. The success of wartime fortification programs, it permanently changed food regulation and public health policy worldwide. World War II forced societies to confront an uncomfortable truth. Many cherished foods were luxuries, not necessities. Under pressure, nations discovered that simpler, more durable substitutes often perform better when survival was at stake. These food swaps were not failures of culture or taste. They were adaptations rooted in realism, science, and hard-earned experience. Understanding them matters because the conditions that produced them, disrupted supply chains, resource scarcity, and mass displacement, are not confined to the past. They are recurring features of human history. If this kind of grounded, unsentimental analysis matters to you, subscribe to the Survival Record and share this video with others who value serious historical insight. Remembering how people survived is not nostalgia, it is preparation.